Hey guys, tonight we're traveling back to the warm sands of ancient Egypt, where gigantic stone temples rose from the desert, sacred cats wandered around acting like they owned the place, and a surprising number of powerful women quietly slipped through the cracks of history. Before we begin tonight's slow journey through the forgotten female pharaohs of Egypt, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy these long, sleepy dives into the stranger corners. And while you're settling in, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. There's something oddly comforting about knowing people across different countries and time zones are all relaxing together while learning about rulers who were erased from history so thoroughly that archaeologists had to piece them back together. Now, dim the lights. Maybe put a fan on low for that soft background hum. Get comfortable beneath your blankets and let's gently drift back more than 3,000 years to a world where kings were gods, pyramids were already ancient, and one woman quietly decided that if Egypt needed a pharaoh, she might as well become one herself. Ancient Egypt loved tradition. Actually, that's putting it mildly. Ancient Egypt loved tradition the way some people love their morning coffee. The entire civilization seemed to run on routines that had already existed for hundreds of years. Priests performed ceremonies exactly as their ancestors had, and at the center of all this tradition stood the pharaoh, the ruler, the living connection between humanity and the gods, the person responsible for maintaining something called ma'at, the sacred balance that kept the universe functioning. Traditionally, this role belonged to men. Now, that didn't mean women lacked power. Far from it. Egyptian women enjoyed rights that many women elsewhere would wait thousands of years to receive. They could own property and inherit wealth. But becoming pharaoh, that was another matter. And yet, every so often, a woman found herself standing unexpectedly close to the throne, which brings us to one of the most remarkable women in Egyptian history, a woman named Hatshepsut. Hatshepsut was born around 1507 BCE into the powerful royal family of Egypt's 18th dynasty. Her father was the pharaoh Thutmose I. As a young princess, Hatshepsut received an elite education. She learned religious ceremonies, administration, and how power actually worked behind palace walls. Like many royal daughters, Hatshepsut eventually married within her family. She married her half-brother, the future pharaoh Thutmose II. The marriage elevated Hatshepsut's position considerably. She became great royal wife, but her husband wasn't exactly destined for a long reign. Thutmose II died relatively young. His death created a problem. The heir, Thutmose III, was still a child, so Hatshepsut stepped in as regent. Officially, she would govern on behalf of young Thutmose III until he reached adulthood. But something fascinating happened. Years turned into more years, and Hatshepsut gradually accumulated authority, more authority, until eventually she crossed a line that very few women in Egyptian history had crossed before. She declared herself pharaoh, not queen, not regent, pharaoh. The full position, the entire job, the complete package. This was an extraordinary decision. She launched one of the most impressive public relations campaigns in history. First, she emphasized her divine birth. She also began appearing in traditional pharaonic imagery. Soon she appeared with the ceremonial false beard and the royal kilt. Some statues even depicted her with masculine features, not to trick people, but because the role of pharaoh had always been male. Fortunately for Hatshepsut, her reign turned out to be remarkably successful. Egypt prospered under her leadership. Trade expanded, construction flourished. One of her most famous achievements involved a trading expedition to the mysterious land of Punt. The expedition returned with treasures: gold, ivory, ebony, incense trees, animals, luxury goods, and then there was architecture. Hatshepsut commissioned one of Egypt's most beautiful structures, the magnificent mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri. Even today, thousands of years later, it remains breathtaking. The entire complex feels surprisingly modern in its symmetry. Hatshepsut's reign lasted approximately 22 years, an impressive achievement. Throughout much of that time, Egypt remained stable and prosperous. Eventually, though, every reign ends. Hatshepsut died around 1458 BCE. At first, her legacy appeared secure. Then something strange happened. Years after her death, many references to Hatshepsut began disappearing. Statues were damaged. Names were removed. Images were erased. Someone was systematically reducing her visibility. For years, historians debated why. Most scholars today believe the erasures likely had political motivations rather than personal hatred. Future rulers wanted a cleaner narrative, a more traditional sequence of kings. Hatshepsut's unusual reign complicated that story. For centuries, much of the world forgot her. One of Egypt's most successful rulers became little more than scattered fragments hidden among ruins. Fortunately for Hatshepsut, archaeologists are stubborn people. Give them enough clues, and they'll reconstruct an entire life story. Bit by bit, clue by clue, the forgotten pharaoh returned, and today, she stands once again among Egypt's greatest rulers. As we continue our journey through Egypt's forgotten female pharaohs, we'll discover others who found themselves navigating this strange, exhausting world. Because ancient Egypt occasionally produced women who refused to remain in the background, and some of their stories are even stranger. Now, as we slowly float away from Hatshepsut's terraces and incense-scented temples, let's turn our attention to another woman who quietly slipped into Pharaoh's role, leaving only hints behind in history's sand: Sobekneferu. Sobekneferu ruled Egypt near the end of the 12th dynasty. Around 1806 BCE, the 12th dynasty is that stretch of time when Egypt seemed almost obsessed with order and symmetry. Basically, the let's get everything right period. It was the dynasty that gave the world the idea that a king's power wasn't just political, but almost mathematical. Every temple, every tomb, every canal was carefully aligned. Everything had a pattern, and deviation was frowned upon. Enter Sobekneferu, a woman who, by accident or design, ended up ruling Egypt after the death of her brother, or maybe nephew. Ancient Egyptian family trees have a habit of looking like modern IKEA instructions. Lots of lines, confusing symbols, and occasional good luck figuring out disclaimers. Sobekneferu's name literally means the beauty of Sobek, Sobek being the crocodile god. Yes, you heard that right. The goddess of Nile fertility and crocodile-shaped chaos had her very own fan club in the royal family. Her name suggests her reign was meant to bring divine favor, and perhaps more importantly, emphasize that she belonged to the cosmic order. Crocodiles, after all, are intimidating, and what better way to say, I am Pharaoh, than to link yourself to a god who literally snaps. Sobekneferu's rise wasn't planned. Her predecessor, Amenemhat IV, died childless, which left Egypt in that awkward who's next moment. And there she was, Sobekneferu, already part of the royal lineage, fully grown, reasonably competent, and thinking, someone has to keep this empire from collapsing. Her reign was short, around 3 to 4 years, but even in that brief span, she made it clear she was no mere placeholder. Official records show she adopted all traditional pharaonic titles. She was addressed as king, even though every scribe knew the truth. This king had breasts. Artists and sculptors of the time, predictably cautious about upsetting tradition, took a middle path. Some statues show her with masculine traits: broad shoulders, pharaonic kilt, ceremonial beard. Others retained delicate, feminine features. Modern historians look at her depictions and shrug. Was she the first gender-fluid pharaoh? Or just a very strategic ruler? She didn't do anything dramatically heroic. No epic battles, no centuries-long expeditions. She simply kept Egypt running. Administrative continuity, temple maintenance, Nile management. Basically, the royal equivalent of making sure the waterworks don't fail. And in a civilization where cosmic balance mattered more than personal flair, that's a huge deal. Still, being a woman in that role invited complications. Propaganda in ancient Egypt often leans heavily toward the pharaoh must be male narrative. So, Sobekneferu had to negotiate a delicate balance, appear legitimate enough for officials and priests to respect, but also maintain her personal authority. She seems to have managed it with quiet precision. No dramatic palace coups recorded, no whispered scandals, just a steady hand at the helm. Yet, as with many women in Egyptian royal history, later generations weren't kind. She was often omitted from king lists. Temples that mentioned her were occasionally modified to remove her name. Stories treated her as a brief, accidental ruler. It's as if scribes wanted history to forget that a woman could manage Egypt's complex bureaucracy without collapsing into chaos. And then there's the mundane detail. She had no heirs, no children, which in ancient Egypt is like leaving a note saying, "Don't expect to be remembered." Without an heir, her legacy was vulnerable to erasure, something historians today are still quietly piecing together. Despite the brevity of her rule, Sobekneferu's reign offers a glimpse into the slow, careful work of a female pharaoh. She managed Egypt like a meticulous gardener, tending a giant garden, knowing the weeds could take over if she faltered even slightly. And like many women in royal history, her subtlety became her disadvantage. Hatshepsut's bold, self-fashioning eventually preserved her memory. Sobekneferu's quieter approach left her more vulnerable to being forgotten. Yet, fragments of her name survive on monuments and inscriptions, whispering across millennia. I was here. I ruled. And yes, I wore the crown, even if no one remembered me properly at first. So, as we let Sobekneferu's subtle authority fade tonight, it's worth noting a pattern. Female pharaohs often operated in the quiet margins of power, excelling in administration, diplomacy, and religious authority, while the world around them tried to keep them invisible, and that makes their stories feel almost miraculous. pieces of a carefully erased puzzle, revealing glimpses of extraordinary resilience. Next, we'll slowly drift toward yet another female ruler, one whose story is even more enigmatic. Bunks almost everything about her remains debated. A pharaoh so early, so obscure, that her existence raises questions about how many other women may have quietly governed Egypt long before history noticed. Now, let's float even further back in time, past the grand temples of the New Kingdom, past the carefully organized pyramids of the Middle Kingdom, into the earliest days of ancient Egypt, when kingship itself was still finding its rhythm. And there, hiding in the shadows of history, we encounter Mernith. Mernith ruled during the First Dynasty, roughly around 2900 BCE. That's more than 1,000 years before Hatshepsut, and over a millennium before Sobekneferu. The world was younger then, Egypt was younger, and royal customs were still being invented. Writing had recently been standardized. Tombs were starting to look like recognizable royal burial sites, and people were still figuring out what it meant to be a pharaoh. We don't know much about Mernith. That's part of the charm. What we do know comes from tomb inscriptions, a few scattered seal impressions, and the archaeological whispers left behind in Abydos, the royal cemetery where she was buried. Even today, standing among the massive mud brick structures and faint hieroglyphs, you can sense the deliberate subtlety of her presence. It's as if she consciously said, "I will rule, quietly, and history will have to catch up." Mernith may have acted as regent for her son, Den, who would go on to become a notable pharaoh of the First Dynasty. Some historians speculate that she may have ruled in her own right for a brief period, but the evidence is tantalizingly incomplete. Some tombs assign her the full title of king, others merely refer to her as the mother of the king. It's a tricky position, being a woman in a world still defining kingship. If we think about it, early dynastic Egypt had no strong tradition of female rulership to lean on, and yet, somehow, Mernith assumed authority at a moment when continuity mattered more than precedent. She governed during a time when central power was consolidating, when maintaining order along the Nile was paramount, and when royal legitimacy depended on careful religious and administrative rituals. Her tomb at Abydos is one of the largest of the First Dynasty. That's a statement. Tomb size, location, and burial goods were the ancient equivalents of social media followers and LinkedIn endorsements, a way of telling everyone, I mattered. I mattered enough to deserve a big stone coffin and lots of offerings. Inside the tomb, archaeologists discovered remnants of wooden and pottery vessels, small statuettes, and the occasional ceremonial object. These items hint at her status and the respect accorded to her role. The scale of her burial suggests she was treated as a sovereign, not merely a placeholder mother. Yet, outside of these archaeological traces, Mernith largely disappears from textual history. There's no sprawling narrative of her decisions, no records of trade expeditions, no dramatic royal portraits. She existed quietly, managing her realm and her son's succession, leaving subtle marks that centuries later would puzzle and intrigue historians. It's easy to imagine her day-to-day life. Palace corridors, buzzing with scribes, priests, and officials. Decisions about grain storage, irrigation, and trade routes. Religious ceremonies that demanded precision because Egypt believed the gods themselves monitored the pharaoh's performance. And in all of this, a woman making choices that determined the stability of one of the earliest centralized states in human history. The contrast with later, more flamboyant rulers is striking. Hatshepsut and Sobekneferu left grand monuments, statues, and inscriptions. Mernith left hints, shadows, quiet authority, as if she knew that history might forget her, but insisted on governing nonetheless, and perhaps that's why her story resonates so deeply. It's not about spectacle or conquest, it's about competence, subtlety, and the strange persistence of women who assumed power in eras that weren't always ready for them. Her influence extended far beyond her lifetime. Even if her name faded, her son Den ruled effectively, consolidating the dynasty's power, and her legacy, though silent, carried through him. In many ways, Mernith embodies a recurring theme among Egypt's female pharaohs, an ability to navigate male-dominated structures with intelligence, strategy, and patience. They weren't always flashy, they weren't always recognized, but their decisions often shaped history in ways that resonate long after they themselves have vanished. As we settle further into the quiet hum of history tonight, it's worth reflecting on this pattern. Across centuries, women stepped into roles of immense responsibility, often quietly, often with minimal recognition, yet with profound impact. Hatshepsut, Sobekneferu, Mernith. Different eras, different circumstances, but similar challenges. How to assert authority without destabilizing the delicate balance of tradition, religion, and bureaucracy. And as we imagine the dusty tombs of Abydos, the imposing temples of Deir el-Bahari, and the palaces of the 12th and 18th dynasties, it becomes clear that female pharaohs were never the exceptions. They were anomalies in historical memory. They governed, administered, and shaped Egypt, only to have the world attempt to rewrite them out. But tonight, in the quiet of our shared relaxation, we can reclaim them. Let's imagine the ripple of their influence flowing along the Nile, the meticulous record-keeping of their scribes, and the silent authority that allowed their sons, successors, and entire dynasties to thrive. Their power may have been understated, but its effects were long-lasting, and if we listen closely, we can almost hear Mernith's voice whispering across millennia, "I ruled, I mattered, and even if history didn't fully remember me, the river and the tombs know my name." As we leave the murky shadows of the first dynasty behind, let's glide forward to the 19th dynasty, roughly around 1191 BCE, where we encountered Tuzret. She is one of the last known female rulers of ancient Egypt, and her story feels both familiar and quietly tragic, like a candle burning at both ends, illuminating the end of a long, complicated lineage. Tuzret began her life as queen consort, married to Seti I. Life as a queen in Egypt had its perks, access to luxury and the finest clothes, but it also came with pressures, palace politics, dynastic expectations, and endless rituals. Every decision mattered, because in Egypt, even a minor misstep could disrupt Makat, the divine balance that supposedly held the cosmos together. Seti II ruled for a time that was moderately uneventful. When he died, the political waters became murky. His heir, Siptah, was a child, or perhaps just young enough to be easily manipulated. In these moments, Egypt often relied on women to stabilize the throne, and Tuzret stepped forward, first as a regent, and then, eventually, as pharaoh. Unlike Hatshepsut, who boldly declared herself king in grand ceremonies. Tuzret's rise was quieter, almost shadowy. She inherited a kingdom already showing signs of strain. Bureaucratic inefficiencies, political factionalism, and regional unrest. Egypt had experienced centuries of dynastic triumphs, but each victory left a trace of fragility. Managing this required tact more than spectacle. Tuzret appears to have ruled independently for a few years after Siptah's death. She assumed full pharaonic titles and commissioned her own monuments. Archaeologists have found inscriptions and stelae with her name, suggesting she was respected enough to receive full royal burial rites. Yet her story ends less triumphantly. Following her death, political turmoil intensified, leading to a period of instability. Tuzret's tomb, though constructed, was disturbed and unfinished, a subtle testament to the fleeting nature of her authority. Her life illustrates a recurring pattern. Female pharaohs could govern effectively, but their legacies were always vulnerable to erasure or minimization. Like Hatshepsut, she had to adopt male iconography, wearing the ceremonial beard and kilt to signify her power. In a world obsessed with male kingship, maintaining order and sustaining religious rituals was an achievement in itself. Egypt's historical memory often treats her reign as a minor footnote, yet it represents centuries of resilience and intelligence. They navigated complex social landscapes, managed court intrigues, and maintained the balance between divine expectation and earthly reality. Their daily routines were filled with prayers, ceremonies, and consultations with priests and officials. While history often focuses on grand wars, the steady administration of a kingdom is quietly heroic, if less flashy. Imagine Tuzret walking through palace corridors or overseeing the Nile's management, a continuity of female leadership. Female pharaohs often had to navigate precarious circumstances and leave subtle legacies that could be erased or overlooked. Yet, despite these challenges, their impact on the kingdom and on history itself was profound. Imagine the temples, tombs, and palaces silently holding these women's stories. The stones remember, even if ancient scribes tried to forget, and in that quiet remembrance, we reclaim their authority, their intelligence, and their resilience. As we leave Tuzret's twilight behind, let's wander through the slightly murkier corners of Egypt's royal history, where women occasionally seized or inherited the pharaoh's crown. Their names are less familiar, their monuments less grand, but their stories are no less intriguing. In fact, part of the charm tonight is that these rulers teach us something subtle. Power doesn't always need fanfare to matter. One of the earliest examples we can glimpse is Ninth-hotep, a queen of the first dynasty, whose name appears on some of the oldest known seal impressions. Her role is debated. Was she a regent, a full pharaoh, or a queen whose authority was so vast that scribes couldn't categorize her neatly? But her burial, one of the largest of the early dynasty, signals that contemporaries treated her as extraordinarily important. Just imagine her walking through the early mud brick palaces of Abydos, making decisions that would influence the very foundations of Egyptian kingship. Fast forward to the Middle Kingdom, and we find Sobekemsaf's daughters, a small group of women who occasionally appear in inscriptions with royal authority. These women were stepping into spaces traditionally reserved for men, governing provinces, managing temples, and ensuring religious observances. Then there's Ahotep-Wine, mother of Amos-Larsur, a woman who lived at the end of the Second Intermediate Period. She managed military and political affairs, while her husband and sons were engaged in conflict. She awarded military titles and issued commands. History rarely labels her a pharaoh, but in practice, she operated like one, maintaining stability during a turbulent time. And we can't forget Ankhesenpepi too, a woman who lived during the 6th dynasty. She was likely regent for her son, Pepi II. Ankhesenpepi's life demonstrates something recurring. Women often stepped into critical roles during moments of transition, maintaining the machinery of government. She may not have appeared in grand statues, but her effectiveness was embedded in the continuity of the dynasty itself. These women share a curious trait. Their power was often invisible to those outside the palace, yet vital to the survival of Egypt. They administered, mediated, and sometimes acted as regents, effectively governing without the fanfare afforded to male rulers. And yet, centuries later, scribes and chroniclers often erased them from king lists, altered their monuments, or simply minimized their achievements, which, if you think about it, is kind of poetic. These women ruled from behind the curtain, shaping the kingdom while leaving only faint traces. So tonight, imagine all these women, Merneith, Sobekneferu, Hatshepsut, Tusret, Neithhotep, Ahotep, and Ankhesenpepi, walking through vanished palaces. Imagine the rituals, the strategic consultations, the quiet decisions that ensured the survival of dynasties. Their power was subtle, but it was real, and in the quiet, we can reclaim it. In the soft hum of the fan or the comfort of a blanket, we can picture Egypt governed by women. History may have tried to erase them, but tonight, in this gentle reflection, we remember as our journey through ancient Egypt draws toward its end. Let's allow ourselves one final walk along the banks of the Nile. The sun is setting, the desert air is cooling, ancient temples cast long, dramatic shadows across the shimmering golden sands. Priests are finishing evening rituals, and scribes are rolling up their papyrus scrolls. The Nile continues its timeless journey toward the sea. When most people think of ancient Egypt, they picture famous male pharaohs like Tutankhamun, Ramesses II, or the colossal pyramids of Khufu. History tends to focus on kings. Yet, scattered quietly between those names, we find women who stepped into moments of great uncertainty. These women ruled because circumstances demanded competence, and competence, as it turns out, can be surprisingly difficult for history to erase. Hatshepsut's enemies tried to remove her memory. Her statues were broken, and her names were chipped away from the stone walls piece by piece. Yet today, we still stand before her magnificent temple at Deir el-Bahri. We still marvel at its beauty and speak her name. Sobekneferu faced a different challenge. Her reign was brief, and her story nearly vanished beneath the heavy weight of centuries of time. Archaeologists reconstructed her life from fragments, a broken inscription here, a damaged monument there. The silence never truly became complete. Mernith ruled so early that her story exists largely in shadows, tombs, and seals. Her achievements whisper across nearly 5,000 years. Then there was Tusret, a ruler of the 19th dynasty. She maintained stability, while larger forces pulled Egypt toward inevitable change. History loves heroes and conquerors, but civilizations survive because someone manages the paperwork, the grain storage, and the daily disputes. Ancient Egypt lasted for 3,000 years. That longevity required administration, patience, and women who stepped forward when nobody expected them to. Many of these women were forgotten because they succeeded. Their reigns were stable, preventing disasters that history usually prefers to record. As centuries passed, foreign empires arrived. Persians, Greeks, and Romans came. Temples crumbled, and cities disappeared beneath the drifting sands. Yet somehow, fragments remained. A name carved into stone, a royal tomb, waiting for modern hands to assemble the story once again. These women were not accidents or interruptions. They were rulers who helped shape one of humanity's most remarkable and enduring civilizations. The Nile didn't care whether its ruler was male or female. The bureaucracy and the temples simply needed governing and leadership. As the stars appear above the desert, imagine Mernith, Sobekneferu, Hatshepsut, and Tuzret, whose stories remain our link to immortality. Thank you for joining me on this slow journey. Let your thoughts drift like the Nile. Sleep well, and I'll see you next time. We're going somewhere a little different. We're not following kings or queens. We're not tracing the arc of some general's glorious career. We're not watching a dynasty collapse from the top down, which, honestly, is a refreshing change of pace. Tonight, we're going to France, and we're going to stay low to the ground. We're talking about the French Revolution, but specifically, the version of it that most people actually lived, not the version with the dramatic speeches and the symbolic guillotines on every street corner, the quieter, messier, more exhausting version, the one where ordinary people, bakers and seamstresses and farmers and shopkeepers, woke up every morning and tried to figure out how to eat, stay warm, avoid being denounced by a neighbor, and generally not die, which, during the 1790s in France, was a more complicated set of tasks than it sounds. So dim the lights. Close your eyes if you want. Let's float back to France. Late 18th century. The streets of Paris smell exactly as bad as you'd expect. Maybe worse. We'll start around 1789, which is the obvious place to start, and we'll work our way through to roughly 1799, which is when Napoleon arrived and told everyone to calm down, more or less. Along the way, we'll check in on the people. History tends to skip over the ones who weren't giving speeches or losing their heads, just quietly trying to survive a decade that kept getting progressively stranger. It's a long story. That's kind of the point. Let's begin. France in the 1780s was, by most measures, not doing great. This isn't breaking news. The country was heavily in debt. The harvest had been bad for several years running, and the gap between what bread cost and what most people could afford to pay for it had become genuinely alarming. Bread wasn't a luxury item in 18th century France. It was the thing, the main event, the cornerstone of the daily diet for the vast majority of the population, which means that when bread prices spiked, and they really did spike dramatically in the late 1780s, it wasn't an inconvenience. It was an existential crisis. The average working-class Parisian in 1789 was spending somewhere between half and 90% of their income on bread alone. Just bread, not rent, not fuel, not clothing. Bread. And that's before we even get to the winter of 1788 to 1789. which was one of the coldest France had experienced in living memory. Rivers froze, grain shipments couldn't move, prices went up further, people went hungry in ways they hadn't for a generation. So when the Bastille fell in July of 1789, it wasn't just a political event. It wasn't just a symbolic strike against royal tyranny, though it was that too. For a lot of ordinary people, it was the boiling point of years of accumulated hunger and frustration. The revolution didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened because people were cold and starving and furious, and they finally had a reason and an opportunity to do something about it. But here's the thing about revolutions that the dramatic retellings tend to gloss over. They don't actually fix the immediate problem. The Bastille falls on July 14th. On July 15th, the bread is still expensive, the winter is still coming, the harvest is still uncertain. The political transformation happening at Versailles and in the National Assembly, fascinating, historically significant, genuinely important, was also, for most people, pretty abstract. You can't eat a Declaration of Rights. This is the central tension that ordinary people navigated throughout the entire revolutionary decade. On one side, a rapidly changing political landscape that promised liberation, equality, and a new social order. On the other side, the very concrete, immediate, daily reality of trying to feed yourself and your family in a country whose economy was in free fall, whose institutions were dissolving faster than new ones could be built, and whose leadership was changing so frequently that it was sometimes hard to keep track of who exactly was in charge on any given Tuesday. Let's meet some of these people, not by name mostly, because the historical record for ordinary folks is patchy at best, but we can sketch the outlines. We can follow the types, the categories, the lives that historians have pieced together from tax records and police reports and diaries and court documents and the occasional memoir, enough to get a sense of what it actually felt like to live through this. Start with the urban poor. Paris in 1789 had a population of somewhere around 600,000 to 700,000 people, which made it one of the largest cities in Europe. A significant chunk of those people were what contemporaries called the sans-culottes, literally without breeches, meaning they wore long trousers instead of the knee-length breeches that were fashionable among the upper classes. It became a political identity, a badge of honor, sort of. The working people, the artisans, the journeymen, the shopkeepers, the day laborers, the people who made things with their hands and lived paycheck to paycheck, or the 18th century equivalent thereof. For the sans-culotte, the early revolution was, at first, something that felt like it might actually matter. The National Assembly was making real changes. Feudal dues were abolished. Serfdom was abolished. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen was issued in August of 1789, and while it was a bit thin on specifics about bread prices, it felt like a start. It felt like someone was finally paying attention. And then the women of Paris decided to walk to Versailles. The October days of 1789 are one of those moments in revolutionary history that gets a lot of attention, and rightly so, because they are genuinely remarkable. A crowd of Parisian women, market women, laundresses, working-class women who were fed up with waiting for the grain shortage to resolve itself, gathered at the Hôtel de Ville on October 5th and demanded bread. When nobody gave them satisfactory answers, they started walking to Versailles, about 12 miles away, in the rain. They were eventually joined by a much larger crowd of men. including some of the National Guard under Lafayette. By the time they arrived at Versailles, they had somewhere between 7,000 and 10,000 people with them. They surrounded the palace. Some of them broke in. There were confrontations with the royal guards. It was chaotic and frightening, and several people were killed. In the end, the royal family was essentially forced to return to Paris with the crowd, which was the crowd's goal from the beginning. They wanted the king and his grain reserves, where they could keep an eye on them. The October days are usually discussed in terms of their political significance, and they were significant politically, but they were also fundamentally a food riot, an act of desperation by women who had spent months watching their children go hungry. While the royal court ate well at Versailles, the politics and the hunger were not separate things. They were the same thing. That's important to understand if you want to understand why the revolution kept escalating the way it did. Because the bread problem didn't go away. Not in 1789, not in 1790, not in 1791. The harvests were bad. The economic disruption of the revolution itself, the flight of wealthy immigrants, the disruption of trade, the depreciation of the assignat, the revolutionary paper currency, made everything more expensive and more uncertain. Ordinary people kept waiting for things to get better. Things kept not getting better. Meanwhile, the political landscape was shifting under everyone's feet constantly in ways that required ordinary people to make constant small adjustments just to stay safe. One of the most underappreciated survival skills of the revolutionary decade was the ability to read the political weather, to know at any given moment which slogans were safe to say out loud, which ones were dangerous, which way the wind was blowing in the National Assembly or the convention or wherever the current seat of power happened to be. This sounds abstract. It was not abstract. It was immediately, practically important in the way that knowing which streets to avoid at night is practically important. Consider the question of religion. The revolution was, in many ways, deeply hostile to the Catholic Church. The Church owned an enormous amount of French land, somewhere between 6 and 10% of the country, and that land was nationalized early in the Revolution to pay off the national debt. Church properties were sold off. Religious orders were dissolved. In 1790, the civil constitution of the clergy required priests to swear an oath of loyalty to the French state, in effect, choosing between their religious vows and their civic obligations. About half of French priests refused to take the oath. These became the refractory or non-juring clergy, and supporting them became, increasingly, a dangerous thing to do. For ordinary people, many of whom were genuinely devout Catholics, for whom the local parish priest was an important figure in daily life, not just religiously, but practically in terms of education, charity, record-keeping, community cohesion. This created an immediate, uncomfortable dilemma. Do you keep attending Mass with a non-juring priest? Do you switch to one who has taken the oath? Do you stop going to Mass entirely? Each of these was a decision with real consequences, depending on who your neighbors were, who was in power locally, and how zealous the local authorities were about enforcing revolutionary orthodoxy. In some parts of France, particularly in regions like the Vendée in the west, the assault on the church became one of the primary catalysts for violent resistance against the revolution. The Vendée uprising of 1793 was, on one level, a counter-revolutionary insurgency. On another level, It was a community of deeply Catholic rural people responding to the forced removal of their priests and the closure of their churches. The counter-revolutionary violence and the Republican repression that followed were catastrophic for the region. Somewhere between 100,000 and 250,000 people died, by most estimates, in a conflict that combined civil war with what some historians have described in terms approaching genocide. But even for people who weren't in the Vendée, who were living in Paris or Lyon, or some medium-sized market town in the provinces, the question of religion was a constant background hum of potential danger. You had to be careful about what you said and who you said it to. You had to know which of your neighbors were devout and which were enthusiastic revolutionaries, and whether those two things were in conflict in your particular street or village. Which brings us to one of the more distinctive features of surviving the revolution, the neighbor problem. The revolutionary period in France produced one of the more unsettling social phenomena in European history, which is saying something, because European history is not short on unsettling social phenomena. It produced a culture of denunciation. Denunciation, the act of reporting a fellow citizen to the authorities for suspicious or counter-revolutionary behavior, became during the Terror, especially roughly 1793 to 1794, a kind of civic duty. The Committee of Public Safety and the Committee of General Security encouraged it. Revolutionary tribunals processed the resulting accusations. Local surveillance committees, the so-called Comité de Surveillance, were set up specifically to monitor the behavior of citizens and receive reports about potential enemies of the Republic. The legal infrastructure for this was the law of suspects, passed in September of 1793, which was about as ominous as it sounds. Under this law, a suspect included anyone who had shown themselves to be an enemy of liberty by their conduct, their connections, their words, or their writings. This is an extraordinarily broad definition. In practice, it meant that almost anyone could be denounced for almost anything, depending on who was doing the denouncing and how the local authorities felt about it. Now, the important thing to understand about denunciation in practice is that it was complicated. It was not purely a top-down phenomenon imposed by a totalitarian government on a terrified population, though there was certainly an element of that. It was also used horizontally by neighbors against neighbors, by business competitors against rivals, by people settling personal scores that had nothing to do with politics. If you owed someone money and they denounced you as a hoarder or a counter-revolutionary, the Revolutionary Tribunal was not always in a position to distinguish between genuine political concerns and a property dispute dressed up in revolutionary language. There are documented cases, quite a few of them, of people being denounced because of long-standing personal grudges that predated the revolution entirely. Feuds over inheritance, disputes about shared walls or water rights, romantic jealousies, professional rivalries. The revolution provided a new vocabulary and a new institutional framework for resolving these conflicts, and some people used it. This is deeply human behavior. It's also, obviously, terrifying for the people on the receiving end. So how did ordinary people navigate this? How do you live in a neighborhood where any of your neighbors might, at any moment, decide to report you for something? Carefully, very carefully, and with a lot of attention through the performance of civic virtue. One of the most important survival strategies of the revolutionary period was what we might call conspicuous republicanism, the visible, public performance of revolutionary loyalty. You went to the civic festivals. You wore the tricolor cockade, the red, white, and blue rosette that was essentially the revolutionary badge. You used the new forms of address, citoyen and citoyenne, instead of monsieur and madame, which had aristocratic connotations. You sang La Marseillaise when it was appropriate to do so. You attended the local section meetings, the neighborhood political assemblies that were a key institution of revolutionary Paris. You did all of this regardless of what you actually thought, because what you actually thought was not, practically speaking, the point. The point was what could be observed. This is not unique to the French Revolution, by the way. Anytime you have a regime that monitors ideological conformity and rewards denunciation, you get this pattern of performative loyalty. People learn to signal the right things in public while maintaining a carefully separated private world. It's exhausting. It creates a kind of constant, low-level cognitive and emotional labor. But it works, more often than not, as a survival strategy. The key was calibration. You had to be visibly loyal, but not so conspicuously zealous that you drew attention to yourself in a different way. You didn't want to be seen as someone trying too hard, which could itself be read as suspicious. You wanted to be blandly, reliably, unremarkably in the mainstream, average, forgettable, a good citizen in the background. People who managed this, well, often survived. People who couldn't or wouldn't manage it through genuine political conviction or stubbornness or bad luck or the misfortune of having the wrong neighbors, sometimes didn't. Let's talk about the economics of survival in a bit more detail, because this is where the daily texture of revolutionary life gets most vivid and also most grim. By 1793, France was at war, not just internally, with the Vendée Rebellion and various other counter-revolutionary uprisings. Externally, too, France was at war with Austria, Prussia, Britain, Spain, the Netherlands, and pretty much everyone else who was alarmed by the direction events were taking. War is expensive. War is also, conveniently, a reason to demand more from the civilian population in the name of national emergency. The convention, the revolutionary government that had replaced the Legislative Assembly, implemented a series of economic controls in response to the crisis. The most significant of these was the maximum, formerly the Law of the General Maximum, passed in September of 1793. This was a comprehensive system of price controls that set maximum prices for a long list of essential goods, including grain, flour, bread, meat, butter, salt, oil, fuel, and clothing. There was also a maximum on wages, though the wage ceiling was set higher relative to the price ceiling, which was at least theoretically favorable to workers. In practice, the maximum was a mess. Price controls without the ability to actually enforce them are just suggestions with consequences. Merchants and farmers who couldn't sell at the controlled prices simply stopped selling, or sold on the black market at higher prices, or found creative ways to reclassify their goods, so they fell outside the controlled categories. Food disappeared from official channels and reappeared in unofficial ones at prices that ordinary people couldn't afford. This created a parallel economy, not quite underground, not quite official, but operating in the murky space between them. For ordinary people, navigating this parallel economy was another essential survival skill. You needed to know who had things, who was selling, what the real prices were, and how to acquire goods without attracting the attention of authorities who might accuse you of engaging in speculation or hoarding, both of which were revolutionary crimes. The food queues, the infamous queues that formed outside bakeries and butcher shops in Paris, became a feature of daily life that occupies a substantial amount of space in the contemporary accounts that survive. Women especially spent hours every day standing in line, waiting to buy bread, sometimes arriving before dawn in hopes of getting to the front of the queue before supplies ran out. There are accounts of women bringing chairs, bringing knitting, bringing children who fell asleep standing up. The queue was social space, as well as commercial space. Information circulated there, gossip circulated there, and frustration circulated there too, which occasionally boiled over into the kind of collective action that the authorities found alarming. Let's pause here and appreciate something. The women standing in these queues, spending 3 or 4 hours a day waiting for bread, then going home to cook what they'd managed to obtain, then managing the household, then caring for children, sometimes also working in a trade, were doing an extraordinary amount of labor just to keep their households alive. And they were doing it in an environment of constant scarcity, constant political uncertainty, and the ever-present background anxiety of wondering whether this month's political winds would blow in their favor or against them. History tends to remember the revolution's dramatic events. The women in the bread queues were living the revolution in a different register, slower, more grinding, more intimate, no less real. Paris gets most of the attention when people talk about the French Revolution, because Paris was where the drama happened: the storming of the Bastille, the Women's March to Versailles, the September massacres, the guillotine on the Place de la Révolution. Paris, Paris, Paris. But France was, in the 1790s, a predominantly rural country. Something like 80% of the French population lived in the countryside, in villages and small towns, farming land that they may or may not have owned, paying rents and dues to landlords who may or may not still be around, producing grain and wine and livestock that supplied the cities. Rural France experienced the revolution differently than Paris did, and in some ways more confusingly. For peasants, and peasant in this context just means rural agricultural worker, not a slur. The early revolution brought some genuinely significant changes. The abolition of feudalism in August of 1789 was, on paper, enormous. Peasants were theoretically freed from the feudal dues, labor obligations, and various other extractive mechanisms that had been part of the rural economic landscape for centuries. This was a big deal. In some regions, peasants had been paying a significant portion of their annual income in various feudal dues. Abolishing those dues meant, again on paper, that they got to keep more of what they produced. In practice, it was complicated. The abolition of feudalism didn't happen all at once. Many dues were declared redeemable, meaning peasants had to pay a lump sum to actually be free of them, and the administrative process for actually sorting this out was slow and chaotic. In some regions, local lords simply kept collecting dues for years after they were theoretically abolished because there was no one to stop them, or the peasants didn't know their rights, or the legal process was too complicated to navigate without help that wasn't available. The sale of church lands, the biens nationaux, as they were called, was supposed to benefit peasants too. There was a lot of church land, and it was being sold off cheaply. And in theory, this was an opportunity for peasants who had never been able to afford land to finally get some. In practice, the people who actually bought most of the church lands were urban bourgeois, merchants, lawyers, professionals, who had the cash and the legal sophistication to participate in the auctions. Rural peasants, who might have really benefited from owning the land they already worked, often didn't have the money or the connections to compete. So the early revolution's economic changes were a mixed bag for rural people. Some things genuinely improved. Many things didn't change much, or changed in ways that benefited someone else. And meanwhile, the political demands of the revolution kept coming. One of the most burdensome of these, for rural France, was conscription. France went to war in April of 1792, and the army needed men. The levée en masse of August 1793, a kind of general conscription of the entire able-bodied male population, was one of the most radical mobilizations of a civilian population that Europe had ever seen. The idea was to put the entire nation on a war footing. Young men would fight, older men would do logistics, women would make clothing and nurse the wounded, children would pick lint for bandages. Everyone had a role. For rural communities, the levée en masse meant losing their young men at exactly the time they needed them most. In the fields, during harvest, doing the essential agricultural labor that kept everyone fed. A village that lost its young men to the army was a village that struggled to bring in the harvest, which meant food shortages that winter, which meant more hardship the following year. This is not an abstract policy concern. This is a very concrete, very tangible consequence that played out in village after village across France. The response to conscription varied enormously by region. In some areas, particularly in the north and east, where there was more alignment between revolutionary politics and local sentiment, conscription was accepted, however reluctantly. In other areas, and the Vendée is the most dramatic example, but not the only one, conscription was a breaking point. The attempt to draft young men in the Vendée in March of 1793 was a proximate cause of the uprising that turned into a full-scale civil war. Even in places that didn't rise in open rebellion, draft avoidance was common. Young men hid. They developed sudden illnesses. They mutilated themselves to be disqualified from service. Cutting off trigger fingers was apparently not unheard of, which tells you something about how people felt about the war. Families concealed their sons. Communities looked the other way. The authorities sent out inspectors. They conducted censuses. They hunted deserters. This created another layer of anxiety for rural communities. The risk that harboring a draft dodger would bring official attention down on the whole village versus the very human instinct to protect your own child from a war that might kill him. Life in rural France during the Revolution was, in many ways, about managing a series of overlapping claims on your resources and your loyalty that often contradicted each other. The revolutionary government wanted grain, men, and political conformity. Local communities wanted to protect their own people and their own practices. The church, or what remained of it, still had moral authority. For many rural people, even as the state was dismantling its institutional power, noble landlords who hadn't emigrated were still present in some areas, still commanding deference from some people. Former feudal obligations might technically be abolished, but social hierarchies didn't dissolve overnight. Navigating all of this required a certain pragmatic flexibility, a talent for appearing to comply, while actually doing what you needed to do, giving the revolutionary officials what they needed to go away: enough grain, enough civic performance, enough revolutionary vocabulary, while preserving what you could of the actual life of the community underneath. This wasn't heroism. It wasn't ideology. It was just getting through. We need to talk about the terror, not in a sensationalized way, in the way you would describe an extended period of institutional violence that ordinary people had to live through without much ability to predict or control. The terror is generally dated from September 1793, when the law of suspects was passed, to July 1794, when Robespierre was arrested and executed, the event known as Thermidor, named after the revolutionary month in which it occurred. During this period, the Revolutionary Tribunal in Paris sent approximately 2,700 people to the guillotine across France as a whole, including executions carried out outside of Paris. The death toll from political repression is estimated at somewhere between 17,000 and 40,000 people, with the higher numbers including deaths in prison awaiting trial. These are not small numbers, but they're also not numbers that affected every person equally. The terror was geographically uneven, socially uneven, and temporally uneven. If you lived in Paris and you had any connection to political life, the terror was a constant, immediate threat. If you lived in a small village in Normandy and kept your head down, the terror might have been something you heard about from travelers and worried about, but didn't directly experience. The geography of the terror followed the geography of resistance. The regions that had risen in counter-revolutionary uprising, the Vendée, Lyon, Toulon, the Federalist cities that had resisted the authority of the Paris-based convention, experienced the most brutal repression. Lyon, which had been under siege by Republican forces and finally fell in October of 1793, was subjected to mass executions that killed somewhere between 1,600 and 2,000 people in a matter of months. In the Vendée, Republican infernal columns were sent to pacify the region after the uprising was suppressed, and they did so with a thoroughness that is difficult to describe without using very dark language. For people who weren't in the counter-revolutionary zones, the terror was still terrifying, just in a different register. The Committee of Public Safety under Robespierre was genuinely attempting to root out enemies of the revolution, and the definition of enemy kept expanding. The initial targets were obvious counter-revolutionaries, nobles, refractory priests, people with connections to emigrant aristocrats. But by 1794, the purges were consuming people who were, by any reasonable measure, committed revolutionaries themselves. The Girondins had been purged. The Dantonists had been purged. Hébert and his faction had been purged. Each faction had been accused of betraying the revolution, usually by the next faction to seize control. For ordinary people watching this happen, the lesson was clear and alarming. Proximity to political power was not protection. It was, increasingly, a risk factor. The safest place to be during the terror was probably somewhere in the anonymous middle of society, not noble, not a priest, not visibly wealthy, but not a known political agitator either. A craftsman, a small shopkeeper, a farmer, someone who had the right symbolic affiliations, wore the cockade, attended the section meetings, addressed people correctly, but who wasn't deeply enough embedded in political networks to be caught in the crossfire when those networks got purged. Even from that position of relative safety, the terror left traces in daily life that were hard to escape. One was the revolutionary calendar. In October of 1793, the convention adopted a new calendar that replaced the Gregorian calendar with a rationalist alternative. The year was reorganized into 12 months of 30 days each, with 5 or 6 extra days at the end. The months were renamed according to seasonal characteristics: Vendémiaire, grape harvest, Brumaire, fog, Frimaire, frost, and so on through the year. The 7-day week was replaced with a 10-day decade, with every 10th day as the day of rest instead of Sunday. This was, from a practical daily life perspective, annoying in ways that are easy to underestimate, not just ideologically, though for devout Catholics, the elimination of the Sunday rest and the renaming of Christian feast days was a significant affront, but practically, the working rhythm of a decade versus a week, the disruption of market days, which were traditionally organized around the 7-day cycle, the confusion of dealing with 2 different calendar systems simultaneously because the rest of Europe was still on the Gregorian calendar, which mattered for trade, correspondence, and any kind of international commerce. The revolutionary calendar lasted until Napoleon abolished it in 1805 and returned France to the Gregorian calendar, which pretty much everyone was relieved about. Another intrusion of the terror into daily life was the renaming fever. Streets, towns, entire cities were renamed to remove royalist or religious associations. The city of Saint-Malo briefly became Port-Malo. Montmartre, the hill north of Paris, became Montmarat after the murdered revolutionary journalist. Lyon, as punishment for its counter-revolutionary uprising, was officially renamed Ville Affranchie, the liberated city, and ordered to be partially demolished as punishment. This was not actually carried out in full, but the decree was real. For people who had lived somewhere their whole lives, who identified with their city by its name, who wrote letters and kept records using the old names, this renaming was disorienting. It required constant vigilance. Using the wrong name for a place in the wrong company could be taken as evidence of counter-revolutionary sentiment, which was, again, not a small thing to risk. Then there were the revolutionary festivals. These were not small, intimate affairs. The revolution was deeply interested in civic ritual, in replacing the ceremonial calendar of the church with a new calendar of Republican celebration. There were festivals for reason, for the Supreme Being, for the Federation, for various revolutionary anniversaries. Attendance was expected. Enthusiasm was expected. The festivals were elaborate, carefully choreographed events designed to embody revolutionary values: unity, liberty, equality, the brotherhood of citizens. Actually attending one of these festivals was an experience that contemporary accounts describe in various ways, depending on who was writing. Enthusiastic revolutionaries describe them as genuinely moving and uplifting. More skeptical observers describe large crowds standing in cold fields, watching elaborate symbolic performances, and trying to look appropriately moved. People fainted, which was usually attributed to revolutionary emotion, but was just as often attributed to having not eaten much that day. The festivals were also surveillance opportunities, which everyone knew. Conspicuous absence was noticed. Section leaders kept lists. It was another box to check, another performance to deliver, in the ongoing project of demonstrating sufficient civic virtue. Let's take a step back from politics for a moment and think about money, or more specifically, about the complete dissolution of the monetary system, which is one of those things that gets less attention than the guillotine, but was probably more directly relevant to the daily lives of more people. The assignat was the revolutionary paper currency. It was introduced in 1789 initially as a kind of bond backed by the value of the nationalized church lands. The idea was that the government would issue these notes, use them to pay its debts, and eventually, holders could exchange them for land. It was a clever, theoretical solution to the immediate problem of government insolvency. The problem is that the government kept printing more assignats, a lot more, as the financial needs of the revolutionary government grew, and they grew a lot, especially once France was at war with half of Europe. The printing presses kept running. By 1795, the assignat had lost approximately 96% of its original value. By 1796, when the government finally abandoned it and tried to introduce a replacement, the assignat was essentially worthless. What does hyperinflation look like from ground level? It means that the wages you earned this week could buy significantly less than the wages you earned last week. It means that shopkeepers quoted prices in the morning that were different from the prices in the afternoon. It means that anyone who had savings, anyone who had been careful and prudent and put money aside, watched that money become worthless. It meant that contracts, debts, rents, and any other financial obligations denominated in assignats became chaotic because what a sum of money meant kept changing. The economic strategies that ordinary people developed in response to this were varied and creative. One was to avoid paper money entirely when possible and transact in kind in actual goods, or in the old metal coins, livre, sou, the gold louis d'or, that had become scarce but retained real value because they were metal. The underground economy of barter and specie exchange thrived during the assignat period. A baker might prefer to be paid in firewood. A landlord might accept grain in lieu of rent. A craftsman might exchange his services for food rather than currency. This was, technically, sometimes illegal under revolutionary price controls, but the laws were unevenly enforced, and the practical need to transact in something that actually retained value overrode ideological concerns for a lot of people. Another strategy was to shift from cash-based wages to in-kind compensation wherever possible. Workers in some trades negotiated to be paid partly in the goods they produced or in food. This wasn't ideal. It could feel like a step backward, like being paid in the old feudal tradition of goods and services rather than money. But it kept families fed. The people who did best economically during the inflationary period were, as is usually the case with inflation, the people who had physical assets rather than financial ones, farmers with land and grain, merchants with stocks of goods, anyone who had borrowed money in stable livres and could repay their debts in depreciating assignats was effectively getting a very good deal on their loan. Their debts were inflating away. Anyone who had lent money was being ruined. This reshuffled wealth in ways that created both opportunity and resentment. New money emerged. Old money was destroyed. The social landscape of who had what was rearranged over the course of a few years in ways that would have taken generations under normal circumstances. Meanwhile, ordinary working people were doing what ordinary working people always do in economic crises, which is work more and spend less and hope that things stabilize before they run out of resources to fall back on. Women took in extra sewing. Men worked longer hours. Children who might have attended school were put to work. Families moved in together to share housing costs. Gardens were planted wherever there was space. Keeping animals, a pig, a few chickens, in the city became more common because the ability to produce even a little of your own food was a meaningful buffer against market instability. The food gardens of revolutionary Paris are a minor but poignant detail. The Luxembourg Gardens, which had been royal property and were now public, were partially dug up and planted with vegetables. Other parks and open spaces similarly converted. People grew things in window boxes, in courtyards, on rooftops. It was a practical response to food scarcity, but it was also, in a quieter way, a kind of claiming of space and resources, the transformation of ornamental luxury into productive necessity. When Robespierre was arrested on 9th Thermidor year 2, which is July 27th, 1794, for those of us still on the old calendar, and guillotined the following day, along with his closest associates, the reaction from the broader population was complicated. In Paris, there was genuine relief in many quarters. The terror had been exhausting, the constant anxiety, the need to perform loyalty, the knowledge that anyone might be next. All of that lifted, at least partially, in the weeks and months after Thermidor. Political prisoners who hadn't yet been tried were released. The Revolutionary Tribunal was reformed. The law of suspects was softened. The pace of executions slowed dramatically. But Thermidor didn't end the revolution. It just changed its character. The period after Thermidor is called the Thermidorian reaction, and while the political violence diminished, the economic situation got considerably worse before it got better. The Thermidorian government, the convention under new management, essentially dismantled the economic controls that the terror had imposed, including the maximum. This was ideologically satisfying for those who believed in free markets. It was practically catastrophic for people who depended on those controls to keep prices within reach. Without the maximum, prices spiked immediately. The harvest of 1794 was also poor. The winter of 1794 to 1795 was severe. Bread prices in Paris reached levels that hadn't been seen even in 1789, the year everything had started. This produced the germinal and prairial uprisings of 1795, popular insurrections in Paris, driven by food scarcity that were much more nakedly about bread than anything ideological. The rioters who broke into the convention in Prairial shouted bread, and the Constitution of 1793, the democratic constitution that had been ratified but never implemented, as if the two things were equally urgent, which, from their perspective, they were. The uprisings were suppressed. The surviving Jacobin leadership was arrested. The working class sections of Paris that had been the institutional backbone of popular political participation in the early revolution were disarmed and their political power curtailed. The Thermidorian government had decided that too much popular participation was dangerous, which is a lesson that conservative governments have tended to draw from episodes of popular radicalism throughout history. For ordinary Parisians, the suppression of the popular movement in 1795 was a moment of political defeat that had very practical consequences. The institutional channels through which working-class people had been able to make their voices heard, the sections, the popular clubs, the Cordeliers Club, were gone or defanged. The language of popular sovereignty that had been so powerful in the early revolution was being carefully managed and circumscribed by people who wanted sovereignty to be popular only up to a point. Life went on. It always does, but it went on in a context where the terms had shifted, and the people who had invested most heavily in the promises of the revolution were facing a growing realization that some of those promises were not going to be kept. The Directory, the five-man executive that replaced the Committee of Public Safety in November of 1795, governed France from 1795 to 1799, and while it has a bad historical reputation, corrupt, ineffective, endlessly factional, it was also the period during which France finally stabilized enough to stop being in constant revolutionary crisis mode. The economy gradually, haltingly, improved. The wars continued. France was still fighting, pretty much constantly, but on terms that were somewhat more organized and less desperate than the emergency mobilization of 1793. For ordinary people, the Directory years were exhausting in a different way than the Terror years had been, less immediately dangerous, but still unprofitable. The economic rebuilding after the Assignat disaster was slow. A new currency, the franc, was introduced and proved more stable. Markets began to function more normally, but the damage of the revolutionary decade, the disruption of trade, the loss of skilled workers to war and emigration, the capital flight of the noble and bourgeois emigrants, the physical damage in the areas of conflict, took years to repair. Let's talk about something that doesn't come up enough in the standard histories of the revolution: continuity, the things that didn't change or didn't change as much as the political narrative suggests. One of the things that often gets lost in the revolutionary story is that most of the everyday texture of life, the things people did every day, the relationships they maintained, the ways they organized their immediate communities, continued through the revolution with more continuity than you might expect from reading the political history. People still fell in love. They still got married. In revolutionary civil ceremonies now, not religious ones, or sometimes both. They had children. Children still needed to eat and be clothed, and occasionally kept from falling into wells. Trades still needed to be practiced. Bread still needed to be baked. Cows still needed to be milked. The guilds had been abolished, one of the early revolutionary reforms, which meant that the old craft organization structure was gone. But craftsmen still worked their crafts. Shoemakers still made shoes. Weavers still wove. Printers still printed. The institutional framework changed, but the skills and the relationships of the craft communities didn't disappear. They adapted. Family networks were enormously important as a survival mechanism throughout the revolutionary period. Having relatives in different parts of the country, a cousin in Lyon, an uncle in Normandy, provided options for people who needed to get out of Paris or who needed to find food when local markets were failing. The letter-writing networks that sustained these connections are partly preserved in the postal records of the period, and they show a constant flow of information about conditions, prices, political situations in different regions. people were monitoring the landscape and communicating what they knew to the people they trusted. Mutual aid within communities was also significant. The formal charitable infrastructure, which had been largely run by the church, had been disrupted by the revolutionary reorganization of religious institutions. But informal mutual aid didn't disappear. Neighbors continued to help neighbors, particularly in rural communities, where the memory of lean years and the expectation of future lean years made it rational to invest in communal solidarity. There were also new forms of community that the revolution created, even as it destroyed others. The section assemblies of Paris, for all their political volatility, were also real community spaces where people met, talked, formed relationships, and built the kinds of informal networks that sustained daily life. The national festivals, annoying and obligatory as they often were also genuine social events where people from the same neighborhood gathered. Even the bread queues, as grim as they were communal spaces of a sort. The revolution also created, despite everything, a genuine expansion of the public sphere for people who had previously had little access to it. Literacy increased. Newspapers, of which there were suddenly hundreds, in the early revolution especially, brought political information to people who had never had access to it before. Public oratory, public debate, public participation in political life. All of these became more accessible to ordinary people during the revolution, even as the specific forms this participation took kept being reorganized and restricted. Women, in particular, navigated a complicated space. The revolution's rhetoric of liberty and equality did not extend to formal political rights for women. They couldn't vote, couldn't hold office, and women's political clubs were banned in 1793. But women participated in the revolution in substantial and visible ways, in the bread queues, in the street politics, in the section assemblies, where they sometimes sat in the galleries and shouted opinions, in the domestic economy that kept families alive. The revolution both opened up and then quite deliberately constrained the space for women's political participation in ways that women of the period noticed and commented on. Olympe de Gouges, who wrote the Declaration of the Rights of Woman and of the Female Citizen in 1791, was guillotined in 1793, officially for counter-revolutionary activities. But the irony of the timing was not lost on contemporaries. The revolution ate many of its own, and among those it ate, with particular thoroughness, were the people who had taken its promises of universal liberty most seriously. Children born in France between 1789 and 1799 were, by definition, children of the revolution in the most literal sense. They grew up in the revolutionary world, which means they grew up with the revolutionary calendar, revolutionary schooling, or the attempt at it, and the revolutionary reordering of social and religious life as their baseline. The revolution had ambitious plans for public education. The idea of a national system of public schools, replacing the church-run educational institutions that had previously done most of the educating, was part of the broader Republican vision for a new, rational, citizenry-minded France. The Jacobin vision of education was particularly radical. State schools that would instill Republican values, scientific thinking, and civic virtue into the next generation. In practice, the implementation was a disaster. The church schools closed. The replacement state schools were slow to open, poorly funded, and staffed by teachers who were either ideologically unreliable from the government's perspective or incompetent. In rural areas especially, public schooling during the Revolutionary decade was basically non-existent. Children who would have learned to read and write in a village school run by the local curé now often learned nothing at all because the curé was gone and the replacement hadn't arrived. Literacy rates, which had been slowly improving in the decades before the Revolution, actually declined in some areas during the Revolutionary period. This is a paradox of the revolutionary program for education. The destruction of the existing system was more thorough than the construction of the new one, leaving a gap that had real consequences for the children who grew up in it. Child labor was entirely normal by 18th century standards, and the revolution didn't change that. Children worked alongside their parents in fields and workshops. They helped in the family trade. They ran errands. In urban settings, children of poor families might be employed as servants or apprentices, sometimes at very young ages. The concept of childhood as a protected space separate from the adult world of work, which we now take for granted, was not a widely shared assumption in 18th century France. What the revolution did change, at least for some children, was their relationship to the public sphere, the language of citizenship, of rights, of the nation. This was part of the air they breathed, part of the content of the festivals and ceremonies they attended. Children marched in revolutionary processions. Children were present at civic rituals. The revolution was deeply interested in the symbolic potential of children as representations of the future, which meant that children were incorporated into public life in various ways. There were also the orphans and displaced children created by the revolution's violence, parents who had been executed or imprisoned, families who had emigrated and left children behind, sometimes deliberately, sometimes not, families destroyed by the Vendée War. The convention made some provisions for the care of these children. The concept of the patrie as the nation-state taking on a parental role was ideologically appealing, but the actual institutions were inadequate to the scale of the need. The child welfare provisions of the revolutionary period are a study in the gap between ideology and capacity. The ideology was generous. Every child of France was a child of the Republic. The capacity was insufficient. There was not enough money, not enough institutional infrastructure, not enough trained personnel to actually deliver on that promise. Not everyone stayed. One of the survival strategies available to people who had the means and the connections was simply to leave. The emigration of the French nobility is well documented in the historical literature. Something between 130,000 and 150,000 people emigrated from France during the revolutionary period, mostly nobles and clergy, but also some bourgeois and even some artisans and workers who fled specific forms of danger. These émigrés gathered in cities along France's borders, Koblenz, Turin, Brussels, London, and constituted one of the revolution's most persistent problems, since they spent the years abroad lobbying foreign governments to intervene in France on behalf of the old regime. But the high-profile aristocratic emigration is not the only story of people leaving. There were also the quieter, smaller, less documented departures of people who weren't noble enough to make the official lists, but who had reasons to be worried. Merchants with the wrong business connections, professionals who had been associated with the wrong political faction, people who had a neighbor with a grudge, could feel the denunciation coming before it arrived. These less prominent emigrants, sometimes called the little emigrants in the historical literature, are harder to trace because they left fewer records, but they existed. People found reasons to be in Geneva on business and then found reasons to stay. People visited relatives in Amsterdam and didn't come back. People slipped across the Swiss or Dutch or Spanish borders with varying degrees of success, depending on how closely the borders were being watched at any given moment. Getting out was a privilege. It required money for travel, connections in the destination country, and either a legal reason to travel, a business trip, a medical consultation, a family visit, or the willingness and ability to travel illegally. Most ordinary people didn't have these resources. Their world was local, in a way that's hard to fully appreciate from a contemporary perspective. The village they were born in, the market town 5 miles away, the city they'd visited once or twice. This was the geography of their lives. Emigrating to London or Vienna or Philadelphia was not a realistic option. For those who did have the option, the decision was often agonizing. Leaving meant giving up property that was likely to be confiscated. It meant giving up community, relationships, the accumulated social capital of a lifetime. It meant uncertainty about whether you'd ever return, and if you did return, whether the things you'd left behind would still be there. The émigrés who returned after the revolution, and many eventually did, under the amnesty provisions that Napoleon later expanded, came back to a country that had changed fundamentally, to find their estates sold off and their social world dissolved, and had to make their peace with a France that was no longer organized around the social hierarchy they'd grown up in. That reckoning was its own kind of survival challenge, different from the material survival of those who'd stayed, but not easier. One of the things that made the French Revolution different from many earlier European upheavals was its ambition to transform not just the capital, but the entire country. The revolution was, among other things, a centralizing project. It wanted to bring France, a genuinely diverse country with regional languages, local customs, varying legal traditions, and substantial internal differences in everything from agricultural practice to religious culture, into conformity with a single national standard. This ambition had practical implications for people in the provinces that are worth spending some time on. Take language. France in 1789 was not a fully French-speaking country. In Brittany, people spoke Breton. In Alsace, many people spoke German or Alsatian. In the south, Occitan and Provençal were the everyday languages of much of the population. In the Basque country, Basque. In Flanders, Flemish. In Corsica, Corsican. There were also numerous local dialects of French itself that varied enormously from region to region. The revolutionary government, particularly the Jacobins, were deeply invested in linguistic standardization. The Abbé Grégoire's 1794 report on the necessity and means of eliminating patois and universalizing the use of French is one of the more remarkable documents of the period. Grégoire surveyed the linguistic landscape of France and concluded that something like 3 million French people spoke no French at all, and that another 6 million spoke it imperfectly. The solution, in his view, was aggressive promotion of standard French in schools, in official communication, in civic life, and the stigmatization of local languages as relics of ignorance and superstition. This was a linguistic project that would take generations to complete. France was still dealing with regional language issues well into the 20th century, but it started here, in the revolutionary period, and it had immediate effects on communities where French was not the everyday language. Official documents were now only in French. Proceedings in revolutionary tribunals were in French. If you didn't speak French, you navigated a legal and administrative world that was not designed for you at a time when the consequences of navigating it incorrectly could be severe. In Alsace, this created particular tensions since Alsace had only been incorporated into France in the late 17th century and still had deep cultural and linguistic ties to Germany. Alsatian Jews, who had their own community structures and languages, also navigated the revolutionary period with a complicated mixture of new legal freedoms. The revolution emancipated French Jews in 1791, which was genuinely significant, and new pressures to conform to French Republican norms that sat uneasily with their traditional communal organization. The situation for Jewish communities in France during the Revolution is worth a pause. The emancipation of 1791 made French Jews legally equal citizens for the first time. This was a remarkable change. French Jews had been subject to various disabilities and restrictions under the Ancien Regime, including limitations on where they could live, what occupations they could practice, and their legal status before the courts. But emancipation came with an expectation that Jews would become citizens first and Jews second. The Gregoire vision of a unified French citizenry with a single language, a single set of civic values, and ideally a single religion, or no religion, depending on the moment, was not ultimately comfortable with the continued existence of a community organized around its own distinct traditions and communal institutions. The revolution offered rights with one hand and expected assimilation with the other. How Jewish communities in France navigated this, holding on to communal identity while performing the civic participation that citizenship required, is a version of the same challenge that many minority communities faced during the Revolution, just with its own specific texture and history. We've been talking mainly about civilians, but a substantial portion of the male population of France during the revolutionary decade was in the army, and their experience of the revolution deserves its own consideration. The French Revolutionary Army was, by the mid-1790s, something genuinely new in European military history. It was a mass conscript army, drawing from across the social spectrum, animated, at least in its self-presentation and ideology, by Republican patriotism rather than mercenary incentive or dynastic loyalty. The armies of the early Republic were often poorly supplied, poorly equipped, and sent into the field before they were properly trained. The butcher's bill in the early war years was staggering, but they also won against Austrian and Prussian professional armies that were, on paper, better trained and better equipped. The revolutionary French armies scored a series of remarkable victories. Valmy in September 1792, Jemappes in November 1792, the campaigns of 1793 and 1794 that pushed back the coalitions that had invaded France. How? The ideological explanation that citizen soldiers fighting for liberty were more motivated than mercenaries or conscripts fighting for a king is partly true and partly self-serving mythology. The structural explanation is more interesting and probably more accurate. The revolutionary armies could draw on a much larger population base than the professional armies of their opponents. They could afford tactical innovations, open order fighting, skirmishing, aggressive offensive action that professional armies couldn't use because they required individual initiative from common soldiers that the hierarchical discipline of a professional army actively suppressed, and they had, at least early on, officers promoted on merit rather than birth, which occasionally meant they actually knew what they were doing. For the soldiers themselves, the young men pulled out of villages and workshops and put into uniforms and marched toward Austrian guns. The experience of the Revolutionary Army was something that didn't fit neatly into either the heroic narrative or the victim's narrative. Letters from revolutionary soldiers, of which a surprising number survive, describe an experience that was simultaneously politically significant and practically mundane and deeply unpleasant. Long marches in bad boots, insufficient food, waiting around in camps, brief, terrifying combat followed by more waiting, officers who ranged from inspiring to incompetent, comrades who became brothers, and comrades who died, homesickness that was raw and constant and not particularly revolutionary in character. Some soldiers were genuinely committed to the Republican cause. Some were not. Most were, probably, doing what soldiers throughout history have always done: coping, bonding with the people immediately around them, trying to stay alive, thinking about home. The army also became, during this period, a significant vector for social mobility. Young men from backgrounds that would have given them no prospects under the Ancien Regime could, in the Revolutionary Army, rise to positions of considerable power if they had talent and survived long enough. The most extreme example of this pattern is Napoleon Bonaparte himself, a Corsican from a minor noble family of no particular significance who, by his late 20s, was commanding armies and reshaping the map of Europe. But below Napoleon, there were hundreds of officers whose careers followed versions of the same pattern, ability recognized and rewarded in an institution that had stripped away the aristocratic seniority system that had previously blocked advancement. This was not pure meritocracy. Connections still mattered, patronage still mattered, luck mattered enormously, but it was considerably more meritocratic than what had existed before, and it drew young men of ability upward in ways that the old system had not. For the families left behind, the mothers and wives and siblings in the villages, the soldiers' absence was a constant background fact of life during the 1790s. Letters came when they came, which was irregularly and unreliably. News of casualties reached home slowly, often through unofficial channels. A wounded soldier returning to his village. A letter passed through chains of acquaintance. The uncertainty of not knowing whether someone you loved was alive was its own kind of suffering. By 1799, the revolutionary decade was effectively over. Though it didn't announce itself that way, Napoleon's coup of 18 Brumaire, November 9th of 1799, replaced the Directory with the consulate with Napoleon as first consul. And while it was, technically, another phase of the revolution rather than its end, it felt like an ending to many people at the time. The exhaustion was real. 10 years of political upheaval, economic instability, war, religious disruption, social transformation, and the continuous background anxiety of navigating a world where the rules kept changing had taken a genuine toll. When Napoleon arrived and started imposing order, even authoritarian order, even order that cost liberties that the revolution had promised, a significant portion of the French population appears to have been genuinely relieved. The Concordat of 1801, which reconciled the French state with the Catholic Church and allowed the reopening of churches and the return of priests, was enormously popular in many parts of France, particularly in rural areas, where the absence of church services had been a genuine deprivation. People who had been conducting religious practice in secret, gathering in barns, celebrating private masses with non-juring priests at enormous personal risk, could now worship openly again. This mattered in ways that were not purely spiritual. The rhythms of religious life, the weekly mass, the feast days, the sacraments of birth and marriage and death, were the rhythms of community life, and their restoration meant the restoration of something that had been missing. The Civil Code, enacted in 1804, codified many of the revolution's legal changes into a stable and coherent legal framework. The abolition of feudalism was confirmed. Legal equality was confirmed. The system of property rights that had emerged from the revolutionary land reforms was given a stable legal foundation. The legal gains of the revolution, in other words, were preserved and organized, while the most radical aspects, the constant political upheaval, the terror, the religious disruption, were ended or reversed. What had all of it been for? From the perspective of ordinary people, the honest answer is, it depends on who you were and where you were and how things had worked out for you specifically. For a peasant who had managed to acquire some of the church lands that were sold off in the early revolution and who survived the decade intact, the revolution had genuinely improved their material situation. They owned land now. They didn't owe feudal dues. Their legal position was more secure. The republic that had emerged, imperfect and violent as it was, had delivered something real. For a craftsman in Paris, who had spent the decade navigating bread shortages, political purges, the collapse of the currency, and the suppression of the popular movement that had promised him a real political voice, the balance sheet was more ambiguous. The formal legal equality was real. The actual economic improvement was slower in arriving. For a noble family who had managed to survive the terror by emigrating, by lying low, by lucky timing, by the death of the revolutionary who had denounced them, the revolution had stripped away the world they'd grown up in and replaced it with one in which their inherited status meant less. Their wealth was reduced or gone, and the social deference they'd been raised to expect was no longer available. For the priests who had taken the constitutional oath and served the revolutionary church, and for the priests who had refused and spent years hiding or in exile, and for the congregations that had navigated between them, the religious experience of the decade was one of disruption, loss, adaptation, and eventually, an imperfect restoration. The revolution as experienced was not one revolution, it was millions of different revolutions, lived by millions of different people, in millions of different circumstances, each of whom made their choices, some brave, some cowardly, some principled, some opportunistic, most just desperately pragmatic, in the conditions they faced, with the resources they had. That's the version of the revolution that tends not to make it into the textbooks. It's quieter than the version with the guillotine, and the great speeches, less cinematically satisfying, but in some ways more interesting, because it's the version that was actually lived. History tends to flatten the experience of living through large events into narrative arcs. The revolution causes, the terror causes, Thermidor causes, the Directory causes Napoleon, clean and sequential and comprehensible. The people who actually lived through it didn't have access to that arc. They lived it in real time, which meant they didn't know what was coming next and couldn't be sure how things were going to turn out. The baker who woke up in January of 1793 didn't know that Robespierre would be dead within 18 months. The farmer in the Vendée who watched the revolutionary columns march into his village didn't know that in 6 years there would be a concordat and his church would reopen. The young soldier marching toward the Austrian lines in 1796 didn't know that the general who'd appointed him to his unit would one day be emperor of the French. They just did what people do. They got through the day. They fed their children when they could and went hungry when they couldn't. They performed the required loyalties and maintained the real ones. They held on to the things they couldn't afford to lose: family, community, faith, the accumulated habits of daily life, and let go, or had ripped away, the things they had no choice but to lose. There's something worth noting about the sheer resilience of ordinary life. The revolutionary decade was, by any measure, a catastrophic disruption: political violence, economic chaos, religious upheaval, constant war, the dissolution and reconstruction of basic social institutions, all of it happening simultaneously over a sustained period. And yet people kept living, kept marrying, having children, practicing their trades, maintaining their friendships, observing their private devotions, keeping their small gardens. The human capacity to maintain the texture of daily life in the face of large-scale historical disaster is not a small thing. It's not the stuff of heroic narratives, but it's the stuff of survival, which is perhaps more impressive in its way. The revolution ended, or rather, transformed into something else, and France continued. The ordinary people who had survived the decade found themselves in a country that was legally, socially, and culturally different from the one they'd been born into. The revolution had happened to them, around them, and in many cases, through them. They had been agents of it and subjects of it simultaneously, as ordinary people always are in extraordinary times. Some of them wrote about it later: memoirs, letters, fragments of recollection preserved in family papers and eventually in archives. These accounts are where the texture of the experience survives: the exhaustion, the fear, the dark humor, the small victories, the sense of relief when a particularly bad period ended, and the cautious, provisional hope that whatever came next might be somewhat better. Most of them didn't write about it. Most of them just got on with things, the way people do, carrying the decade inside them, the way any generation carries its defining experiences as a background to everything that came after, shaping how they thought about safety and scarcity and authority and loyalty in ways that they might not have been fully able to articulate, but that nonetheless shaped their choices for the rest of their lives. The French Revolution is usually told as a story of ideas and power, liberty, equality, fraternity, and the various ways those ideas were betrayed, deformed, and eventually institutionalized. That story is real and important, but underneath it and alongside it is the other story. The story of the bread queues and the revolutionary calendar and the neighbor who might denounce you and the priest hiding in the barn and the soldier's letter that arrived 3 months late and the garden planted where the king's roses used to grow. That story is also the revolution, probably more of it by volume than the other version, and it's worth knowing about even at this hour with the lights dim and the blanket pulled up. Which brings us very gently to the end of tonight. We covered a lot of ground. Revolutionary France, from the streets of Paris to the fields of the Vendée, from the bread queues of 1789 to the quiet relief of the Concordat in 1801. We followed the sans-culottes and the peasants and the soldiers and the women waiting in line before dawn, and the men performing their civic virtue while thinking their own private thoughts. The guillotine got some time, but mostly we stayed with the living, which feels right for a bedtime story. If you're still awake, good night. If you drifted off somewhere around the inflationary collapse of the assignat, also good night. That was a reasonable place to go. France survived. So did you. We'll do it again next time.